Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. Throughout history, how have Americans thought about their own self-defense? Have they always thought about it like they do today, as expansive, global, and ideological? Andrew Preston, Professor of American History and Fellow of Clare College at Cambridge University, discusses these questions by looking at the history of the idea of national security and how it is different today than in the past. This talk took place at the University of Texas at Austin and was sponsored by the Clements Center.
Thanks so much, Will. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm not sure what it means to be the last of the program, the last of the year to speak, whether that raises expectations or whether I'm scheduled last because things are going to blow up and not go so well. I'll go out with a bang and a blaze of glory, but I'll try and do my bit to make sure that the end of the year ends on a high note. And I look forward to your questions and comments on a project that is ongoing for me. Before I begin telling you about the invention of national security, I want to thank the Clements Center team for the invitation, but also for being extremely efficient and extremely generous and gracious hosts. It's always nice to come back to UT. It's nice to come back to Austin. I spent a lot of time here doing research for my PhD, which Will mentioned was on the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and the origins of the Vietnam War. So I spent a good deal of time in Austin at the LBJ Library, and I've been back a few times to speak or to attend conferences, but I haven't been back now in I think a good 7 years or so. So this is a really welcome opportunity to come back to a city and a university that I really like. So thanks again for the invitation, and thanks for coming today to hear me talk. And what I'd like to talk about today is a book that I'm in the process of writing now, and it's a history of national security, and especially a history of the idea of national security, of how Americans have thought about their self-defense and have thought about threats in the international system over time. Today's notion of national security is very capacious. When President Obama or President Trump, whenever they or anyone in their administrations or anyone writing in the newspapers would say that the United States is doing X, Y, or Z in the name of national security, even if people disagree with exactly what the president is doing, everyone has an intuitive understanding of what national security means. That it's the protection not only of America physically, and of American interests in the rest of the world, but it also is about protecting against threats that could be global, and it's about protecting ideas and ideology. So it's global and ideological. The global gives today's sense of national security a breadth that traditional definitions of self-defense didn't have, that self-defense, American self-defense, could be found literally anywhere in the world, not only in places like Vietnam or Iraq, but also in countries like the Ivory Coast, which was the subject of an American national emergency. The United States was under a declaration of a national emergency for 5 or 6 years because of events in the Ivory Coast. And this was under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And most Americans aren't aware that there was a national emergency declared not over the southern border, but over Ivory Coast. That's an extreme example of a sense that American self-defense could be found anywhere in the world, and it could begin for any sorts of indirect reasons, reasons that are indirect to American interests, let alone American safety. And I don't even have to mention, and I won't mention, Trump's declarations of national emergency more recently, and what he has defined as national security. They have this broad global sense. But they also have not only breadth, but what I would call depth. American national security has a depth in the sense that it's also ideological. It's about protecting not only Americans' physical safety, but also their way of life. And you see that all the time in declarations of national emergencies or invocations of national security, that it's about protecting American way of life. Or as Trump said in one of his first speeches on North Korea, that it was about protecting not necessarily Americans' physical safety, although that I think just goes without saying, but it was about protecting American civilization. I just want to pause for a second because that way of thinking about a nation's self-defense is today, I think, familiar to everyone. It's intuitive. I'm not sure even if you disagreed with President Trump or President Obama's exact or specific foreign policies, that we would necessarily disagree on what the essential meaning of national security is and what American self-defense means in a globalized world. But traditionally speaking, if we look at international history, that's actually a really revolutionary reconceptualization of what a nation's self-defense would be, that it's as broad to be global and that it's as deep as to be so ideological, in addition to protecting against physical dangers. And the book that I'm writing now essentially asks the question, has it always been thus? Has American national security ideology or doctrine or thinking or whatever we want to call it, has it always been in the way that we think of it today? Has it always been so expansive? Has it always been so capacious? Has it always been so global? And has it always been so ideological? And the answer I want to propose to you today is no, which is lucky for me, because if the answer was yes, it has always been thus, then I wouldn't really have much of a book to write. It'd be a pretty boring book, just the invocation of one example after another. But I'm arguing that American threat perception and American ideas of self-defense changed at a particular time and for particular reasons. And so what I want to do today is give you a sketch of when and why American thinking on national security changed. Not very many historians have thought about these questions. I'm not the first. I don't want to claim that I am the first to think about national security in this way. There have been other historians who have come before me, and I'm building on their work. And in some senses, I'm arguing against some of their work as well. Most historians have assumed that national security is what it is and was what it is today, that it has been timeless. And there are historians who write about the national security of the founders, or the national security in the antebellum period, or the national security of Abraham Lincoln, or of other American statesmen in history. And that's an idea that I'm very much, as you'll see, going to be arguing against, that it's not timeless and that it's the product of a particular time and place. Those historians who have looked at national security as an invented tradition, or have looked at national security as having an origin point, have almost all of them have begun in 1947, and they concentrate on the 1947-1952 period. And that makes sense. If you're to think of national security and the idea of national security as having an origin point, the most obvious place to begin is 1947. Why 1947? Most obviously, that's when the Cold War ramps up. That's when tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States reach a point where we see something emerge that we could call the Cold War, a state of war short of actual conflict, of permanent hostilities that don't actually lead to war, but of enduring competition, and the building in the United States of what we now call the national security state. This began in July 1947. So the account goes, it began in July 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act, a single piece of legislation that invented the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the CIA. And this period finishes in 1952 with the creation of the National Security Agency. So here we start to see the term national security being applied to all sorts of incredibly important institutions. And I don't have to tell this audience or any audience in the United States just how important, not only to American foreign policy, but to American life, something like the National Security Agency is. So in 1947, we have the creation, the founding of the NSC, the DoD, the OSD, the JCS, the CIA, and then shortly thereafter, the NSA. So 1947, in a lot of senses, makes sense to look at, to sort of, date the beginning of this new way of thinking about national security with an act, a piece of incredibly important piece of legislation that is called the National Security Act. And I'm not denying that that is an incredibly important watershed in American history. What I'm offering instead is a way of us to see 1947 and the National Security Act not as a beginning point, but as an end point. And that the crucial period instead for the invention of national security, if we think of it as an invention, is instead 1937 to 1947. Before the late 1930s and early 1940s, American notions of self-defense were, I would argue, primarily territorial. American self-defense was about defending direct attacks on the territorial sovereignty of the continental United States. And I'd argue that this notion remained predominant until 1937, when it was then broadened into something much more capacious, something that we now know today as national security. The very term national security was hardly used before 1937. But in the period between 1937 and 1941, between Japan's invasion of China proper in the summer of 1937 to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, in those 4 years, Franklin Roosevelt used the term national security more than all other presidents before him combined. And American statesmen in earlier periods, going back to the early national period right up to the era of Woodrow Wilson, almost never used the phrase national security. And so national security, I would argue, is not a timeless concept, but a product of its time and place. And that we should see it as an invented tradition, a tradition that was invented at a very important, very febrile moment in the 1930s and 1940s, an invented tradition like many others from this exact same period of the 1930s and the 1940s and early 1950s, when the United States was reeling from a successive hammer blows of things like the Great Depression, World War II, and the early Cold War. That was a period that was forcing Americans to rethink their place in the world, and as a consequence, to rethink who they were. And so I would put national security alongside a lot of other invented traditions from this period, like the American dream, the American way of life, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the liberal tradition, and American exceptionalism, all of which are terms that now are taken as givens to describe the American experience, but didn't exist before the Depression and came into being and really came to be commonplace by the early Cold War. And I would offer that we should put national security alongside these other invented traditions. So the question now is, why then? Why the late 1930s and 1940s? And indeed, why at all? And that's what I'd like to use my remaining time to explore. Why national security? Why in the late 1930s and early 1940s? And what exactly did it mean for the development of American history? I would argue that three factors combined in a unique way in the late 1930s to give rise to a new doctrine of national security and a new way of thinking about threat perception or threats to the United States in the world system. And those three reasons, which I'm going to explore in a little more detail, are globalization, the domestic political context, and the New Deal, which is something I'm going to spend probably the majority of my time analyzing. So globalization, the domestic political context, and then New Deal liberalism. So the first of these probably needs the least explanation. It's the most obvious explanation as to why Americans started seeing international threats in global and ideological terms. It's not a mystery why this thinking emerges in the late 1930s, early 1940s, if we consider the emergence of totalitarian ideologies in Europe and Asia that Americans now began to see as existential threats. At the same time, we had the growth of an American internationalism. Now, internationalism is a notoriously difficult term to define, but I would define it as a way of seeing the world as not only interconnected, but interdependent. And where Americans began to see in an interdependent world that they had rights, but they also had responsibilities and duties to other countries in terms of maintaining security and maintaining order and maintaining prosperity. So, of course, they have this kind of dialectic relationship, the emergence of mass totalitarian ideologies, and along with massive armies behind them in Nazi Germany, the Communist Soviet Union, and Imperial Japan. And at the same time, you have the maturation, the development and maturation of an American international ideology that sees the world not only as interconnected, but interdependent. And with the rise of American internationalism, you have an elite in Washington, New York, and elsewhere, not so much among the American people, which I'll get to in a second, but you have an elite, a governing elite, a banking elite, an intellectual elite that now believed that America was in danger in a way that it had never been before. And it couldn't rely on the oceans or on friendly neighbors to the weak and friendly neighbors to the north and south to maintain security. That America was now in danger with these mass totalitarian ideologies, with the growth of military technologies like air power, and with this sense that was not unique to the 1930s or not new to the 1930s, but certainly reached, I would say, a critical mass, that the globe was shrinking, the world was shrinking, and that problems that once seemed very far away were now actually rather close at home. So the context, the international context of the late 1930s and early 1940s, combined with the economic crisis of the Great Depression, which of course was a global economic crisis, lead to a new sense of vulnerability among Americans. And the dangers that once weren't all that dangerous are now dangerous. President Woodrow Wilson, before Franklin Roosevelt, before the 1930s, gestured at this new way of thinking, of seeing the world, of seeing the United States in the world system. Wilson definitely saw the world as interconnected, and he definitely saw the world as interdependent. And I'm using Wilson as shorthand for a large number of Americans who thought very deeply about foreign policy in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Wilson gestured at this notion, and he thought in global terms, and he positioned the United States as a fundamental and fundamentally very important actor in the world system. But he didn't complete the process that Franklin Roosevelt would complete later on. When Wilson saw the world as interconnected and interdependent, and when he brought the United States into World War I, he did so not on the terms of security or of self-defense, but of making the world safe for democracy, of stabilizing a world system, of intervening in the European balance of power in a way that would be conducive to American interests. What I find very interesting about Woodrow Wilson in the First World War is not only does he not use the term national security, he uses very few synonyms or synonymous terms to national security, like self-defense or threats to the United States. He certainly saw Germany in World War I as a threat to the international system, and he saw Germany as a threat to the United States. But Wilson did not engage in the rhetoric that we'll see in a second from Franklin Roosevelt in the late 30s, or we would later see, say, with Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam, where if the United States doesn't act to intervene against these threats over here or against these adverse actors in Europe or in Asia, then eventually that threat is going to reach back to the United States. In other words, we don't see Wilson saying something like Lyndon Johnson said in 1965, if we don't stop them in Saigon, the next thing you know, they're going to be in San Francisco. And as far as I can tell from looking at Wilson's rhetoric and at his papers and those of his aides, there's very little, there's almost none of that thinking that the United States itself is in danger. Instead, what Wilson was saying to Americans is, we need to get involved in the European war in order to make for a better world, but not necessarily to protect ourselves. And that's an absolutely crucial distinction, as we'll see in a second. And Wilson, as I said before, didn't use the term national security, at least not in a foreign policy sense at all. He used it in passing a couple of times in an incidental way in which he's talking about the security of the nation, therefore he's talking about national security. But it's clear he's not using that in a way that would have been familiar to Franklin Roosevelt, let alone his successor presidents. So the first reason is globalization and the growth of American internationalism. The second reason why we see the emergence of national security in the late 1930s is the domestic political context. So if we had the rise of American internationalism, led by people like President Roosevelt, but then lots and lots of other people in the Roosevelt administration and beyond, most Americans did not share this view. Most Americans did not want to get more involved in the world crisis in order to resist Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. Most Americans at the time in the late 1930s believed that America would be safer, because that's essentially what I'm talking about, not what's advantageous for the national interest, but what's essential for American safety. Most Americans thought they would not be safer if they got involved in the world crisis, and in fact believed the opposite, that getting more involved in the world crisis would make the United States less safe. Now, these people have, I'm not the first historian to make this particular argument right now, but I think there's still a common mistake in the historiography, and it's certainly in the popular political culture, to refer to these people as isolationists. There were, to be sure, in the late 30s and early 40s, hardcore isolationists who wanted to withdraw from the world simply to remain in the United States and let the rest of the world do what it wanted to do. But that was a very small minority. Most of the Americans who did not want to get involved in the world crisis were a kind of internationalist. They were a kind of American who viewed the world as interconnected, as interdependent, in which the United States had a huge role to play. They just didn't think that the United States should be getting involved in this world crisis to the point of going to war. These people, I think, are more accurately described as anti-interventionists, as non-interventionists, but not as isolationists. And I'd like to use the figure of former President Herbert Hoover to describe what I mean. Herbert Hoover was a great critic in the late 30s and early 40s of FDR's foreign policy and of American internationalism that was bordering on interventionism, where Americans, an elite cohort of Americans wanted to get involved in the world crisis to the point that it would probably, almost certainly, bring the U.S. Into war. Hoover was absolutely dead set opposed to these policies. But there's no way we could call Herbert Hoover an isolationist. He was almost certainly the best traveled American of his generation. Maybe the missionary leader John Mott might rival him in terms of the number of miles traveled around the world and countries visited. But even if it's John Mott or Herbert Hoover, Hoover was very much a citizen of the world and a man of the world. He was not an isolationist. He did view the world as interconnected and as interdependent. He just didn't see that American security and American self-defense was tied to events in Europe or in Asia. And in fact, he argued that if America did intervene in the world crisis, it would lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. It would actually make Americans more insecure, not only by involving them in wars that they didn't really have any business in, but also by curtailing American freedom at home. Because he thought that if the United States went to war, it would inevitably mean the curtailing of civil liberties and significant government intervention in free markets, even much more so than Americans had already seen under the New Deal. Hoover traveled America in 1939, 1940, 1941, at the same time that people who probably could be called isolationists, like Charles Lindbergh, were also traveling the country, arguing against American intervention in the world crisis. Hoover's message was rather different than the America Firsters like Charles Lindbergh, because he was saying that Nazi Germany is terrible and what they're doing is terrible. They're odious people and we should have no business with them. But having no business with them also means not going to war with them. Bless you. And that if the United States did get involved in resisting Nazi Germany in something that wasn't Americans' business, Hoover said, it would actually rebound at home domestically in a way that Americans wouldn't like. Again and again on his tour of America in 1939, 40, 41, Hoover hearkened back to what was until then the prevailing view of American self-defense, which was that self-defense meant defending the continental United States. Self-defense meant defending territory, and the Germans were not about to attack the United States. There were all sorts of fanciful plans that were drawn up in the late 1930s about the Germans perhaps maybe invading Brazil or Central America, and then moving up north and maybe taking over Mexico and then maybe attacking the United States. And I actually found out at dinner last night that this thinking is older than the 1930s and it goes back to the Progressive era, which I'm sure is true. There's also evidence of this thinking in the 1880s and 1890s. But given that the Germans were incapable of even crossing the English Channel and invading Great Britain, it was beyond the realm of possibility, of plausibility, that they were going to be invading Brazil or Mexico and then moving north to take on the United States. And people at the time said this. Anti-interventionist internationalists like Hoover, also like Charles Lindbergh, said that there is no way that Germany is going to attack us. And even if Franklin Roosevelt and other internationalists were sincere in saying, no, we are under physical danger here from Germany or from Japan, most Americans didn't really buy what Roosevelt was telling them. They sided more, polls show, with Hoover and Lindbergh and others. In response to this, we can see Franklin Roosevelt and internationalists who supported him beginning to, as my former colleague John Thompson has argued, exaggerate American vulnerability, to stretch the meaning of self-defense. So essentially what Franklin Roosevelt did was concede to Hoover that yes, the Germans aren't going to attack us, attack American territory. They're not going to attack the continental United States. But what Roosevelt then began saying, arguing in 1939, and especially in 1940 and 1941, is that self-defense is about much more than defending territory. That self-defense is about defending an American way of life. It's about defending an American dream. It's about defending freedom and democracy in other parts of the world, even if we ourselves are not about to be attacked. Because Roosevelt went on to say in several speeches, if we don't nip that threat in the bud that doesn't seem like a threat to us physically now, it will eventually grow to become a threat that will affect us physically. And here he's harking back, or he's sort of drawing on the first reason that I outlined, which is globalization and the new dangers that globalization prevented. So Franklin Roosevelt and others, including Edward Mead Earle, political scientist at Princeton, who actually convened a seminar in 1940-41 on the terms of what is national security. For an historian, I have to tell you, it's an absolute dream to find a series of files like this that are labeled national security. What does it mean? Where Edward Mead Earle, and other experts would sit around a seminar table and say, so what does this new national security mean? And they say, well, it means protecting ideas, and it means protecting a way of life, and it also means protecting against global threats, which will eventually come back to harm the continental United States. So at the very baseline somewhere, the defense of continental territorial sovereignty is still at the very base of national security. But what Franklin Roosevelt and Edward Mead Earle and others have done is broaden out how you get to that baseline sense of continental territorial sovereignty, the defense of continental territorial sovereignty. And you do it by expanding the notions of self-defense into this new idea called national security. And like I said before, in that 4-year period between 1937 and 1941, and especially in 1940-41, Franklin Roosevelt uses the term national security to refer to foreign policy more than all other presidents before him combined. And this brings me to my third reason. If the first was globalization and the second was this domestic political context in which Roosevelt has to come up with a compelling answer to Herbert Hoover, why are we under threat? What's the danger here? And the third reason is that that national security was very much embedded in New Deal liberalism. So I'm sure everyone here knows what the New Deal was. This massive regulatory state that set up a social welfare net for the United States for the first time. It didn't regulate the American economy for the first time. We see that in the progressive era, but it's the largest and most enduring, because of course many of the provisions of the New Deal still exist today. But it's the largest economic regulatory up to that point regime in American history. And it was overseen by a series of alphabet agencies, which I'm sure are familiar to a lot of you. I'm sure your professors use the editorial cartoons when they from the 1930s when they lecture on the New Deal, showing Americans using a Scrabble board to try and piece together what the New Deal agencies were. You had any number of them: the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which was the AAA, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, or the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm mentioning that even though I know you all know that already, because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes. When I began working on this history of national security, mostly in a strictly foreign policy sense, with a bit of domestic politics, with basically Hoover against FDR, that's what the project initially was. I did what everyone probably does today when they're researching an historical topic, and I did keyword searches in digitized databases going back to the late 18th century. And when I began this project, I initially assumed that national security was timeless and that I would find all sorts of, I would get all sorts of hits in doing a keyword search for national security going back to Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton and all throughout. And in fact, the problem that I thought I would have when I began these keyword searches for looking for national security is that I would have not just thousands, but not just tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of hits. And there's no way that I could go through everything. And I started thinking, how am I going to narrow this search down? Instead, I started my keyword searches with national security in newspaper databases or JSTOR or Congressional Record and whatnot. And I had the opposite problem, where I had almost no hits. Or rather, I would get a lot of hits, but almost none of those hits, none of those results referred to foreign policy, warfare, military policy, self-defense in the world system, self-defense against Canada or Mexico or something like that. It just didn't, I wasn't finding national security referring to foreign policy or national security in the way we would think about it today. And when I did find it, every now and then, very rarely, I would find it in a way that I think I mentioned, I found with Woodrow Wilson, where if someone used the term national security in a foreign policy sense, it was simply that they put national as an adjective before security, and they're not really talking about national security in the broad and deep way that we see today. It just was an incidental reference to the security of the nation. And then when I read about what they were saying, they were referring to national security in the sense of the defense of the territorial sovereignty of the continental United States. And I was really frustrated, because I thought I was going to have this problem of too much evidence. Instead, I had the opposite problem, which is even a bigger problem for the historian, of not enough evidence. And I found that even FDR was using national security in this way. So if you look at FDR's first term up to 1936, 9 times out of 10 when he uses the phrase national security, he's referring to the Depression. He's talking about closing banks temporarily. He's talking about regulating securities. He's talking about unemployment insurance and that sort of thing. And I thought, what a waste. This isn't what I'm looking for at all. And then it kind of hit me. And this is what I really want to just explain in a few minutes here before drawing to a close. National security up to the middle part of the New Deal, up to the middle 1930s, in Anglo-American economic thought, not just in the United States, but also in Britain and Canada and elsewhere. National security meant pensions, workplace accident insurance, unemployment insurance, medical insurance, all sorts of types of insurance and types of socioeconomic security that we would see codified in the New Deal. And this is what Franklin Roosevelt was referring to in the first and second New Deals in his first administration. This national security to him meant essentially the domestic socioeconomic programs of the New Deal. And then in 1936, 1937, FDR's use of the term national security in that socioeconomic sense pretty much disappears. And all of a sudden, he starts using national security to refer to distant ideological threats like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and saying that these threats can eventually come and affect our national security and pose a threat to us. And what I'm arguing in this book is that that's not a coincidence. That what Franklin Roosevelt did is deliberately take a term that was socioeconomic in nature and then apply it to foreign policy. And this is why I see national security as deeply embedded in New Deal liberalism. That national security then became another part of the government's duty, as the Roosevelt administration and New Dealers saw it, of the government's duty to protect citizens in an increasingly integrated and dangerous world. And that world could be integrated and dangerous in an economic sense because of the emergence of industrial capitalism, which of course dwarfed many other aspects of American life as well as the life of other societies. Or it could be protecting against threats in a foreign policy military sense. But either way, in a lot of cases, these are distant, remote threats in which the US government now has a duty to protect American citizens against these threats. And I think it's a little glib to think of it in these terms, but I find it helpful myself. If Social Security provided security against unemployment and old age at a time when there was high unemployment, but most Americans were at work and did have a job, and most Americans were not about to retire. So if you're to protect against remote and distant threats in that sense, in a socioeconomic sense, national security then provides security against distant and remote threats that might one day very well could harm the United States as well. And was this a coincidence? I'm arguing that it wasn't, and that Social Security and national security are two sides of the same coin. And that coin is about the federal government stepping in and then, for the first time in American history, offering a blanket protection to American citizens against threats in the modern world. The great New Deal historian William Leuchtenberg once said famously that the New Deal was an analog of war. And I think that's absolutely true, especially for Roosevelt's first term in the first and second New Deals. But I'm arguing that the reverse can also be true. The New Deal was an analog of war, but war can also be an analog of the New Deal. And if we sort of follow this path right down to its logical conclusion, that the last of the alphabet agencies that we see the New Deal administrations under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman initiate, the last of the alphabet agencies were the NSC, the DOD, the OSD, the JCS, the CIA, and in 1952, the NSA. And I think this helps explain also another puzzle which I've always wrestled with, why most of the war presidents of the 20th century, and still the presidents to this day who have waged the biggest wars in American history, for better or worse, were liberal Democrats with a progressive domestic agenda. Woodrow Wilson, who again gestured at this but didn't bring it to full realization, but then Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson. And I think it also helps explain why there was a confluence, not just a coincidence, but a really tight confluence, not only on the liberal progressive side of the warfare welfare state, but also why so many conservatives, nationalistic conservatives, who were not anti-military, they certainly weren't pacifists, were critics with equal intensity of both the New Deal and the national security, what we later call the national security state. People like Herbert Hoover and Robert Taft, and it's a more complicated example, but also Dwight Eisenhower. This new doctrine of national security became firmly crystallized in the crucible of the early Cold War, and this is where we get to the National Security Act of 1947, and it's why I see the National Security Act of 1947 as an ending point rather than a beginning point. Ever since, its underlying meaning has remained more or less constant, even if particular national security policies or attitudes have fluctuated and changed. I think one of the biggest change points is after Vietnam, where because of intervention in Vietnam, progressive Democrats, liberal Democrats, sort of sour on the national security state. And that link between warfare, welfare for Democrats kind of becomes broken. And a sort of opposite process happens for conservative Republicans, where they make their peace with the big warfare state, not necessarily saying that they're aggressive in waging war, but they make their peace with a big permanent military, even if they don't embrace the welfare state at the same time. I'd like to finish there, but thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Please do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.